Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, I would like to thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Vanessa Clow, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. Our Food for Thought live streaming series serves as an opportunity for alumni and friends to hear from faculty experts, explore topics of interest, and stay connected with IU and the College of Arts and Sciences, regardless of your location. Tonight's program will be our last Food for Thought live stream of the spring semester, but we'll begin a new season of online programming in August. I'd like to thank those of you who have joined us throughout the past year. It has been a delight and privilege to connect you with your academic home, and I hope you'll join us again, either online or here in Bloomington for an event this fall. At this time, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's featured presenter, Galen Clavio, an associate professor of sports media and director of undergraduate studies for the Media School. Professor Clavio's research focuses on social media and digital media in the sports environment. He is particularly interested in how social media influences the interaction between sports stakeholders. Professor Clavio also oversees the Indiana University Sports Media Program, which consists of over 250 students. Following his presentation, Professor Clavio will be joined by Grace Ybarra for the audience Q&A session. Ms. Ybarra is a senior in the Media School studying broadcast journalism in Spanish. While at IU, Ms. Ybarra served as an IU basketball reporter for the Indiana Daily Student and Inside the Hall. Following graduation later this week, she will be joining WCBI-TV in Columbus, Mississippi as a sports reporter and anchor. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's discussion. Simply click on the Q&A tab located in your webinar toolbar. Hover your mouse over your screen and your toolbar should appear. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Galen Clavio for his talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you to Grace, and thanks to all of you for joining me today as we dive into a pretty unique part of the athletics landscape, particularly in college right now, which is name, image, and likeness. But it's really a lot more than that. And this is a topic I know that's galvanized a lot of people's attention over the course of the last year, but really, especially in the last couple of months. And it's funny, when I first presented this idea to Vanessa as something maybe to talk on, it was a very different landscape even then, and that was only a few months ago. So much has changed in such a short period of time. So what I'm going to do to start this talk is take you through a presentation where I talk about the background of NIL, why we're at the spot that we're at from a college athletics perspective, and what some of the implications have been through the first 9 to 10 months of the new name, image, and likeness landscape. We're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end. There's no way, unfortunately, that I can cover all of the different aspects of name, image, and likeness in college athletics in a presentation. So what I don't cover that you're interested in, please ask the questions, put them in the Q&A. Grace will be handling that and kind of asking the questions on your behalf. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share this PowerPoint, and we will dive in and talk a little bit about some of the things we need to be keeping in mind when we talk about name, image, and likeness. So when we talk about recent changes in NCAA policy, what we're finding now is that college athletes are able to profit off of their name, image, and likeness, or NIL, as we'll call it. This has led to a bit of a Wild West scenario playing out among major revenue-generating college athletic programs at the Division I level. And you're seeing all kinds of folks who aren't normally in the college athletic space publicly having what some people think is an outsized role in what happens with college athletes, what happens with individual programs. Now, the core messaging vehicle for a lot of the NIL field is social media, because that has allowed athletes to communicate directly to audiences and followers in a way that just didn't exist even 10 years ago. But there's other aspects of NIL as well. So what we're going to talk about here is how social media changed the landscape for college athletes, but also how the antecedents of NIL essentially led us to the position that we're in right now, and some of the things that we need to think about as we move forward, as the NCAA itself tries to figure out a way out of the situation that college sports currently finds itself in. And hopefully we also ask ourselves some questions about whether we even need to be finding our way out of that area, or whether this is, for athletes, a better spot than we've ever had before. So let's start off by talking a little bit about name, image, and likeness. When we say that, when you hear that in the media, what does it stand for? What it means basically is an individual's name, image, and likeness rights are the unique identifiers that encompass one's right of publicity or the right of an individual to control the commercial use of one's identity. And this is something that actually all college students, all people have, except historically for college athletes. College athletes were not allowed to profit off of their own individual rights of publicity. Those were essentially rights that schools and conferences in the NCAA demanded be handed over to the athletics department. So if you think about it from that perspective, a lot of talk around college sports centers on this idea that, you know, college athletes are just like regular college students. This was one very prominent way where they were not the same, because your average music school student or business school student could profit off of who they were and what their publicity would allow them, but a college athlete on an individual basis could not. Now, what changed over the course of the last year is that the NCAA, up until 2021 in July, basically had rules on the books, like I said, that did not permit athletes to promote or endorse a commercial product or service, even if they were not paid to participate in the activity. And this stance, along with many other stances that the NCAA has had over the years, is informed by the NCAA's perspective on amateurism, which is a term that we hear bandied about a lot. It's been used essentially synonymously with college sports probably for as long as most of us can remember. But, you know, it's important to keep in mind that amateurism as a concept is not something that necessarily has to be synonymous with college sports or sports in general. It's also something that frankly has been outdated for a while everywhere except college athletics. So, you know, the amateur model, and I do a whole lecture in one of my classes on this where we just talk about the history of the amateur model, really had its origins in 19th century England. And it was essentially a mechanism that prevented the working class who worked with their bodies, worked with their hands and legs, from being in direct athletic competition with people that were going to universities, which at the time was exclusively upper class males who were engaging in athletics as part of trying to become a more well-rounded individual, essentially. Amateurism was installed in college athletics to supposedly prevent college athletes from being exposed to the dangers of the professional marketplace. But as I mentioned, amateurism as a concept is pretty badly outdated. A lot of people think that the Olympics, for instance, are still amateur athletics, but the Olympics and the sport federations that surrounded the World Olympics, both summer and winter, fully professionalized their sports by the late 1980s. And the old weird pattern of having people be professionals 3 years and then reclassifying as amateurs for the 4th year so they can qualify for the Olympics, that went out the window a long time ago. So we're already dealing with a bit of an outdated model that existed in college sports. And, you know, what occurred over the course of the last couple of decades, essentially, was a real concern about the finances of college sports, not just within the confines of college athletes potentially being allowed to make money and monetize their brand value, but also just due to the sheer amount of money that was pouring into college sports from all angles, which still is happening to this day. So looking at the push for allowing athlete compensation, it really started to pick up steam in the early to mid '00s, so about 15 years ago. And, you know, really it's centered around, again, allowing athletes to monetize their brand value, developing a professional media, and in the last 10 years or so, social media presence for athletes, evening out the financial inequities of the collegiate athletics model, and finding a path for colleges and universities to avoid paying players directly, which ends up being kind of ironic as we move in and talk a little bit more about how the theory behind this has hit the road in terms of practice. You can't talk about name, image, and likeness or anything involving revenue without talking specifically about the money in college sports. And when I talk to students, when I talk to just fans and people that observe college sports, it's always a surprise to people how much money is in college athletics. And I think more to the point, how much new money is in college athletics and how much of that has happened in the last 15 years. So if you go back to 2005 and you talk about the Power Five conferences in Division I of college sports, so the Atlantic Coast Conference, the Big Ten, the Big 12, the Pac-12, and the SEC, you see that in 2005, revenues combined for those conferences were $570 million. In 2020, revenues were $2.8 billion, which is an immense positive curve when it comes to revenue growth. Most of that revenue growth has come from one primary source, and that's television contracts, which makes sense if you think about it, because not only have you seen increasing amounts of money being paid for college athletics rights by ESPN, Fox Sports, CBS, NBC, but you've also seen the proliferation of networks specific to conferences. The Big Ten Network, of course, famously launched in 2007 as a partnership with Fox Sports. The Big Ten Network is actually half owned by the teams or the schools in the Big Ten and half owned by Fox. ESPN shortly afterwards launches the SEC network. There's now an ACC network. There's a Pac-12 network. So you're seeing increasing revenues, not just from traditional television sources, but also you're seeing revenues coming in from these relatively new televising sources. This is a little bit of a pixelated chart, and I apologize, but it's basically a nice linear graph of the growth in total revenue generated by college sports programs. You can see, going from just slightly over $4 billion in total revenue generated in 2003, and this is all divisions, all schools, all conferences. It was $14.1 billion in 2017, and that was 5 years ago. So you carry this line out, you're starting to get a sense of how much more money is in the pot now than was in the pot 20 years ago. And this is going to continue. So a recent piece by The Athletic detailed what's likely to happen as we get our next round of television contracts in the Power Five conferences. And you can see here, if you get a college football playoff expansion, you're really looking at a Power Two conferences. The SEC and the Big Ten, with their anticipated revenue growth over the course of the next 7-8 years, you're looking at an average payout estimate per team for the SEC of about $117 million a year in 2029, $101 million per team, per school in the Big Ten in 2029. You drop down to the Pac-12, the ACC, the Big 12, the other three of the Power Five, they're not getting nearly as much money. So you're looking at a lot of separations occurring right now in college sports, almost entirely because of the money that's entering in from television. What we're also seeing is a replacement of that money elsewhere besides being put back in the pot for players, since the whole amateur model is, while athletes can't be paid for their services outside of tuition and fees and a couple of other small exceptions, most of that money has gone into either facilities or salaries for coaches. So you can see here on this chart, this looks at the growth of men's head coaches and full professors in college sports. And this was during kind of the early stages of this growth from 2005 until 2012. And you can see that men's basketball coaches saw their salaries essentially double on average during this time period. Football men's coaches, almost the same. And you can see that several sports, even down at the 1AA level, start to see these significant increases when you look at comparisons to an average faculty member at some of these institutions. So I show you this because this ends up really encapsulating a lot of the problems with the money in college sports and why there's been such a push to find a way to get money in the hands of athletes. Because whether you're looking at a chart like this or whether you're looking at some other materials, you're seeing money going everywhere else in increasing numbers over the course of the last decade. You can see another example here. If you look at the span of time in terms of how much football coaches have made versus even university presidents or executive officers, the growth has been off the charts and is only continuing to go up. And this isn't intended to be a criticism of coaches. It's really more a commentary and an observation of how the financial system of college sports has been broken for quite a while. Now, the NCAA has, and I think it's important first to also say this isn't necessarily an explicit criticism of the NCAA, because it's important to remember what the NCAA is. The NCAA is the membership of the entire organization, which is over 1,000 schools. You know, you get up to the Division I level, there's 350 plus schools at that level just by itself. So a lot of finger pointing has taken place at the NCAA over a variety of things over the years. And while I certainly think the NCAA deserves its fair share of criticism, a lot of the issues that we've seen in terms of modernizing college athletics, the NCAA is essentially a shield behind which schools and athletic departments have been able to hide because it allows for a lack of collective action. And this has been an area where collective action has been very difficult because ultimately there's a lot of competing ideas within college sports about what the best models are, and you know what's going to work for an Alabama or an Ohio State isn't going to work for a Division II or Division III school or even a smaller Division I school. So the NCAA as a unit really had a chance to do something with name, image, and likeness, had a chance to do something with collective licensing deals for players, things of that nature, but really after a lot of debate and a lot of internal back and forth, instead did very little and essentially hoped that the courts or Congress would save them with an antitrust exemption or something that would allow them to continue the model that they've used over time, which essentially said athletes are amateurs, athletes are college students, they're not employees, therefore they don't get compensation beyond what we are willing to give them. Well, as I said, that didn't happen. And in fact, the courts gave the NCAA a rare 9-0 rebuke involving a case that directly spoke to the heart of amateurism, which is really what set off a lot of the NIL related things that have occurred over the last year. So now the NCAA and its member institutions have been trying to either institute bylaws or get the federal government to step in and fix the current situation. But it's difficult to do because essentially the Supreme Court stance makes it very, very fraught to try to step in and restrict the rights of athletes at this point to earn money for their services. And the concern, both I think writ large around the NCAA and with some of the individual schools, is that any conference or any school or the body as a whole trying to step in and institute rules that would limit compensation is going to get shot down in court once again. You've also got this, because there's no federal law and because there's no NCAA laws or guidelines, you've got this patchwork of state legislation where you've got a bunch of different states with a bunch of different NIL rules, and just it makes it very interesting trying to decipher what all is going on. There's some states that have a very wide open approach to this. There's some states where there are certain restrictions on things that athletes can and can't receive or can and can't be involved in. But it's essentially uneven. A lot of people were concerned that this year of college sports was going to be really negatively affected by that. It didn't really seem to be. So it does beg the question about what's going to happen moving forward if there is no uniform national law, if it's just this patchwork of state laws. Now, it's important to keep in mind that when we talk about NIL and when you see NIL related items in the news, there's really two different types of NIL that we're talking about right now. What I call original intent NIL deals, the thing that I think a lot of people had in mind, the thing I talked about a bunch when the restrictions were loosened on NIL back last summer, focused on this idea that athletes were going to be able to receive compensation for doing things based upon their name, image, and likeness or their rights of publicity that they weren't able to do before. So for instance, the NIL deals as constituted under the original intent items allowed athletes to receive compensation for giving private lessons or camps or clinics, allowed athletes to receive compensation for product endorsements, receive compensation for autograph signing sessions, and also be able to solicit funds through crowdfunding for nonprofits or charities. These were all things that athletes were not allowed to do under the prior rules. We've also seen schools being allowed to give educational experiences and educational bonuses to athletes under the new guidelines. I just saw a story earlier today about how at Ohio State, I think it was any athlete that hit a certain threshold from a grade point average perspective got like a $5,500 bonus or something like that. So those sorts of payments are allowed under the current framework. One of the stipulations of this, and it actually applies to the other category as well, is that athletes are not allowed to use the marks and logos of their college athletics institutions when doing these types of name, image, and likeness deals. So if you have an athlete that wants to sign a name, image, and likeness deal with Culver's locally, they could only appear as themselves, not themselves with an Indiana University jersey on or anything along those lines. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's potential issues with licensing and trademarks and so forth. So that was just kind of taken out of the equation. And a lot of people thought, well, that's going to cut down on athletes' market value because a lot of their market value is perceived to be intrinsically tied in to the university and to being in uniform at the university. And in some cases that's been the case, but in other cases that hasn't really been much of a restriction. I've got up here an example of a sponsored ad. This is off of Haley Cavender's Instagram. So the Cavender twins were among the highest profile college athletes to take early advantage of this original intent type of name, image, and likeness. This is a paid promotional social media ad that they posted, which featured this company 6-Star, which is basically like a protein shake nutrition type of product. Now, both of these ladies were basketball players at Fresno State. They since have transferred to the University of Miami and have received a significantly larger amount of money off of a different name, image, and likeness deal, which really ends up being a good example of the second type of NIL and the one that's got most of the folks in this business a little bit upset right now, which is collectives and private NIL deals, which have really been a lot more lucrative for athletes. So in the first category, you've got athletes, sometimes through agents and sometimes through these collectives, signing individual sponsorship deals with local companies and featuring in their advertisements and promoting those companies. But then you've also got these, either NIL collectives or whether it's a bunch of alums or whether it's an individual who's utilizing a business. There's a lot of different examples that we could go through, able to raise millions of dollars to provide financial compensation to players. And this has led to kind of a shielded effort that allows boosters to get involved in direct negotiations with athletes. Now, I want to be clear, that's not the case with all of these collectives, but it is happening with several of the higher profile ones. I mentioned the one involving the University of Miami. There's a similar one with Texas A&M, where what you're seeing is essentially something that looks very close to what you would call pay for play. This idea that, unlike in that original intent NIL deal where you're earning the money based upon your own market value, utilizing your own media abilities and savvy, or whatever you're perceived as having savvy within the eyes of that company. In this case, it's essentially, if you play for us, you will get X amount of money, which will come in the form of a name, image, and likeness deal. That's the loop, or the loophole or the workaround that you're seeing a lot of athletes and their representatives utilize. The aforementioned University of Miami booster / NIL collective manager has said that everything he's doing is compliant with Florida state law. And he may very well be correct. He's a lawyer. I actually think that he knows what he's doing on this front. But it's a complicated space because it really isn't the intent that I think a lot of people had when name, image, and likeness first became a reality a little over a year ago. The NCAA has been unwilling to try and enforce the current rules, again, as I said earlier, because of the fear that there's going to be lawsuits involved if they do try to enforce. But what we saw actually yesterday, a story came out that an NCAA task force has drafted guidelines to try and threaten schools over booster noncompliance. This idea that if boosters are getting involved in recruiting and trying to financially induce players to come play for individual teams, whether that's fresh recruits coming out of high school, or as we saw in college basketball, and we're seeing right now in college football, players transferring from one school to another with an NIL deal waiting for them. The NCAA task force is looking at this, appears to be saying, we're going to threaten essentially the schools with potential sanctions if they've got boosters operating on behalf of recruiting efforts for the school. Now, the problem there, and I included this tweet from Mitt Winter, who's an excellent follow on Twitter. It's actually, this tweet is like 3 hours old. But it was a quote off of an article on a website called On3, which I highly recommend reading, where it details some of the issues the NCAA is having with figuring out how to police this and how to navigate this new space. Now, it sounds like schools and conferences need to do a better job of educating athletic directors on antitrust law, asking the NCAA to create uniform rules around compensation and other things is failing to realize how the law works. That's the exact thing held to be illegal in Alston, which was a case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court involving athlete compensation, and this idea that you couldn't artificially restrict college athlete compensation without it being seen as a violation of antitrust law. And so that's the other gorilla in the room here, is that the laws really don't sit on the NCAA and its membership's side as much as they seemed to even 2 or 3 years ago, because now you look at the space and you say to yourself, well, what you're doing is actually you're keeping this adult, this legal emancipated adult, from being able to earn money off of who they are and what they do. And we don't really see that in most other places within the law. It's important to keep in mind that there's a lot of money here already. We looked at the television money that comes into college athletics in general. Just on athlete endorsements right now, there's $6 billion spent each year on athlete endorsements. And that's more professional than college, but you're opening up a whole new vista here in terms of athlete endorsement money and the ability of companies to pay for that. A lot of athletic departments and even some NIL collectives, and Indiana University falls into this mix as well, work with social media companies that manage these sorts of things. So Indiana uses a company called Open Doors, which provides services to athletes largely by helping them understand how their social media accounts work, how they're viewed, what sorts of influence they have, and allowing athletes to better leverage social media and their social media presence. It also helps schools leverage social media presence to help with recruiting, and it can help NIL collectives ensure that they are operating within the letter of the law. Whether or not that falls under the spirit of the law is another story. What this has largely done, and I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, is that name, image, and likeness and the way that it has exploded and it's touched on all these other areas has really shed a light on the underground economy for college recruits that's been there for decades. So you see the stories about Texas A&M and Miami and some of these other schools, but what I think is important to keep in mind is that there's always been a huge underground economy with money going to to potential players or their parents. Spend any amount of time reading about college athletics at the highest levels, spend any amount of time reading materials with anonymous interviews from players and their parents and things like that. And you realize that this economy's been there for a long time. So to some degree, what this whole situation has done is bring that economy above ground and now make it legal, which to some people is distasteful. To others like myself who have just been following it for a long time, it's like, well, okay, now everybody's finally seeing what we've been seeing for the longest time, which is that this is how the sausage is made, so to speak, when it comes to college athletics at the highest level and the recruitment process that exists there. What we're seeing at this point is a lot of different approaches being taken. Top recruits, transfers can earn over $1 million a year in NIL deals. And many of the deals, even before everything exploded here over the last couple of weeks, many of those deals were clearly a quid pro quo for being an athlete, not necessarily doing any particular work. there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I think the idea that athletes were going to be earning NIL deals based solely on the fact that, they were a really good spokesperson, if people really thought that, that was a bit naive. So what you see now, essentially, with the current NIL landscape is how normal college students would earn money, which is, if you're somebody that people want to hire as an endorser, great, you can do that. But you're also seeing how college athletes have generally earned money off of their college athletics prowess in the past with the second type of NIL deal and the sorts of things that we've talked about with that. So I think it's important to keep in mind a few things here as we wrap up the presentation part of this, which is first, there's a lot of market power that college athletes have due to their popularity and due to their social media use. And I look at those as two separate things. Popular athletes that have a high level of skill, athletes that rank very highly in recruiting circles among the revenue generating sports are starting to realize a more open evaluation of what their talents and their overall popularity is worth on an open marketplace. And it's to some degree deep into that marketplace, because if you were a school or attached to a school in the past that was afraid of running afoul of NCAA guidelines or recruiting rules, you're less concerned about that now because things are up on the table. Social media use is still very important. And I think what we're seeing is certain athletes, Cavendish Twins being a good example of that, De'Aaron King, the quarterback from Miami last year, several others, Quinn Ewers, who was a high school quarterback who left high school in Texas a year early to go to Ohio State and was able to sign some marketing deals there. You're able to leverage both your popularity and your ability as an athlete, but also your ability to leverage social media to carry sponsorship messages and things like that beyond where they might have been carried before and reach a younger audience. The market isn't fully there yet for social media because a lot of athletes aren't yet that adept with figuring out how to fully monetize what they're doing, but that market is developing over time. And I think it's going to be an important and interesting thing to watch over the next 5 years, because that is really the next huge growth area within athlete and sports sponsorship, is how can we have college athletes leverage themselves better in that marketplace. The last thing I'll say here is that there's a historical lesson that I think is worth repeating when it comes to NIL and athlete compensation. And it really goes back to Major League Baseball. In the history of I'm going to stop sharing the screen here and get back on. The history of Major League Baseball back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was all about the reserve clause, which essentially allowed baseball teams to unilaterally make decisions about whether they wanted to extend an athlete in contract or not. They were very restrictive in terms of the money that they would pay professional baseball players, and professional baseball players kept saying, look, we need a bigger piece of the pie. It doesn't have to be the whole pie, but it needs to be a bigger piece than what we've got. And baseball, because they had all the power at the time, kept saying, no, we're not going to do things that way. We're going to do things this way, which led to the series of lawsuits in the 1970s that resulted in unrestricted free agency among baseball players. And that all happened in the span of about 5 years. And what we're seeing with college sports in the NCAA is much the same thing. You're seeing this explosion of public money going to athletes, and what it's leading to is a very different landscape than what most of you are probably used to, having watched college sports for however long you've been alive and watching college sports. I think the NCAA and its member institutions had a lot of room to give here, and to some degree that time may be over. We'll see what happens with some of the steps that the membership wants to take in the next year or two, but it leaves us in a very uncertain position as far as name, image, and likeness, and one that I think we can all watch pretty closely and with a lot of interest, because it's going to have some effects on the way college sports is conducted. College sports will probably look very different 10 years from now than what it does right now. With that, I will bring the wonderful and talented Grace Ibarra on so that we can tackle some questions. Grace, first of all, thank you for taking time out of finals week to do this.
You act like I have any finals. I'm done with college, Galen. It's okay.
Fair point. All right, what are we going to start off with questions-wise?
Let's start off with a simple one. I think it's something that is also just really topical right now. And let's see, I'm going to press the answer live button, so hopefully this works. Is the transfer portal going to drive athletes to transfer just for an NIL deal?
Yes, I think we've already seen that happen to some degree. And, I think there's a couple of things that are important to keep in mind. We have been conditioned as observers of college sports, as fans of college sports, to view college athletes like they're different in certain ways from regular college attendees than others. But in other ways, we're supposed to treat them exactly the same. Transfer portal is a great example of that. A lot of people have been getting pretty angsty over the freedom of movement that's being exhibited by college athletes. But to some degree, I think that's a good thing as opposed to a bad thing, because that's the same level of movement that an average college student is allowed and has been allowed for decades. Now, what's interesting about NIL is it's not just transfer portal driving athletes to transfer just for an NIL deal. It's also the possibility of an athlete not transferring because of an NIL deal. There was an interesting article in the Indy Star today by Zach Osterman about that very thing, about how Trace Jackson Davis, who isn't in the transfer portal, but is considering whether to stay or go, and NIL might potentially keep a player like that at a school like Indiana, because it might provide greater financial compensation than going and playing overseas, or going and playing in the developmental league. So it is one of those situations where a player that is good might be able to command a good NIL deal somewhere and will transfer as a result of it. But it also might allow certain players and certain teams to stay put. And I think that's an important factor that we need to keep in mind with all this.
Let's go to the next one. It's from Tim, and it says, is there an age factor here? Is it possible that, or likely that we see this move to high school level NIL for 5 stars or top 100 recruits?
It's possible, yes. I mean, it's interesting because the state of Texas, when they put their NIL rules in, they tried to set it up in a way that was going to benefit colleges, but protect high schools in Texas by saying high school athletes are not allowed to participate in NIL. And that's what led Quinn Ewers, who was the quarterback from Texas I was talking about, to graduate a year early and go to Ohio State because he could get an NIL deal a year early. Now, ironically, he did that for a year, and then he transferred back, and now he's at the University of Texas. So he ended up kind of being the best of both worlds there. I will say this, I think with high school athletics, there's already a fascinating marketplace around top 100 recruits. I did a research study like 8 or 9 years ago with a colleague of mine at Louisville, Dr. Evan Frederick, about the marketplace that high school football recruits have on Twitter already. You were talking about, and Grace knows these folks because she followed them for the last couple of years as a reporter. You're talking about high schoolers with 400,000, 500,000, 600,000 followers on one social network, let alone you put all those together, you might be topping 1 million in a lot of cases. That's a tremendous amount of marketing power. When you look at just your standard everyday social media influencer, they're fortunate if they have that many followers. And so to some degree, I think, high schoolers, because they haven't had to sign contracts, they've got more freedom if they're allowed. Yes, they are minors in most cases, but they have more freedom to capitalize on their name, image, and likeness. In the past, the problem has been that could be viewed as professionalization as a high schooler, which could make you ineligible for college. That may be gone now. And I think that actually puts high schoolers who are really good at sports in a better position to capitalize on being good at sports.
Next one here is from Joel, and it says, how will NIL compete with university fundraising like the varsity club at IU?
Joel, that's a great question. And I don't think anybody really knows. I mean, to some degree, you're taking money out of one pocket and putting it in another when it comes to like where the money ends up going. Now, certainly something like the varsity club is spending their money on different things because they have to. But, I think the average donor, they're still going to want the perks of donating to a varsity club. They're going to want the good seats by courtside, or they're going to want access to private practices, or whatever your individual school's got. But they're also going to want to be able to acquire access to players on their own terms. And that's always been kind of the tension with boosters. Boosters have been able, through this underground economy, to have that kind of access. And it's always been kind of hush hush. And unless you pull a Bruce Pearl and invite everybody to a barbecue or something like that, which I've always said probably a bad idea in college sports. But I think there's enough money in the pot for both, because what you've got at this point is you've got your own personal, I'm going to be able to donate money and I'm going to get X, Y, and Z for it, better parking, better tickets. But you're also going to have this pool where it's like, I'm helping to get athletes to come to and stay at the school that I love or the school that I've got the most interest in. I'm sure there will be some kind of an effect, but I also think it's probably going to broaden the pot a little bit, because you're going to have more people willing to donate, at least in the near term on the NIL side. While the varsity club donors, I'd be surprised if that money necessarily fell off. You may just not see the same level of increase you've had in the past.
Now, this one is more on the education front, because these athletes are going to school too. Other than the OSU bonus you mentioned for academic performance, does the education of college athletes currently have any role in college sports? Is one and done the future of college sports? Well,
it's a complicated question, because there are certainly a lot of sports where education is a key factor. But one of the things I think is hard for people who don't work in higher education or who aren't students to understand is how unusual the life of a college athlete is. You're at practice constantly, you're traveling constantly, you're getting essentially different accommodations a lot of times to take tests that your fellow students are taking. You're having to schedule all your classes in a block because your practice time is 6 a.m. to 10 or something along those lines. And so, I do think that education still matters in college sports, but I also think that from a financial perspective, the importance of college sports to an institution is in the marketing, and it's in the alumni relations, and it's in this idea that if you have good high-level college sports, and it doesn't always have to be like the traditional revenue-generating sports like football or men's basketball. Different schools have different things that they hold dear from an athletics perspective. And so I think from the standpoint of how education plays in, athletes are normally in fairly good shape from an academic perspective, because there's such an ecosystem that surrounds them at the college level, whether it's tutors or accommodations being made. A lot of people get concerned about the educational mission being lost, but I don't really know as of this point what the direction is going to be. There are scenarios that people have talked about where you have college age athletes who get some degree of education, but the actual athletics programs are essentially a completely separate unit that just uses the marks and logos and licensing properties from the school that they're connected with. There's other models where you've got the revenue sports treated differently than the Olympic sports. There's a lot of different directions that this could take. As far as whether one and done is the future of college sports, it's ironic. I think NIL might actually make one and done less common, because right now, and I think this is important for everybody to remember, if you're a high level college athlete and there's a professional league above you, so take out a lot of the Olympic sports, because college sports is essentially the de facto professional leagues for gymnastics or swimming and diving or something like that in the US. But if you're a basketball player and you're not quite good enough to go pro, but that as a 19-year-old, if you stay another year in school, you're throwing away a year of your prime athletically that you may never get back on the back end. Because you want to chase your professional dream, you can make money doing that now at the college level, where you have more value, where you're more established, and maybe you're more effective. So it isn't necessarily a case where you're just going to automatically see one and dones. I think to some degree, it almost makes college a more valuable proposition for a lot of athletes that aren't quite at the elite level that they need to be to get to the pros.
This next one is about those non-revenue sports that you were talking about. And Jenny asked, what advice do you have for any non-revenue athlete, let's say in this case, a field hockey athlete, in terms of NIL?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that, in the short term, I don't think those sports are going anywhere. I mean, Title IX is still very much in existence. Athletic departments have a duty to provide equal or proportional representation for athletes, male or female. If you want to take advantage of the NIL marketplace, my advice is to learn to leverage social media effectively. Now, are you going to be earning tens of thousands of dollars off of your Instagram posts or what you're doing on TikTok? Probably not. But when I talk to college athletes or when I talk to coaches about this, one of the things I say is cultivating a personality, cultivating a brand on social media. And it doesn't necessarily have to be personality driven. Like, it's not all, Pat McAfee or the Cavender twins. You can be a brand by exhibiting your skill as an athlete or by taking people inside the sport. And I see that increasingly among a lot of college athletes, where they are able to essentially act as a translator for the audience and do so in a way that makes them a fun follow, makes them somebody that people look forward to with the content that they're creating. It's a lot of work and it's hard to balance. And I say this as someone who works with sports media students, and I'm constantly, Grace can tell you this, like I'm constantly saying, you got to create content all the time. You got to do all this on top of everything else you're already doing. It's hard to do as a college athlete, but that would be my advice right now is if you want to get in on the game and you're in a non-revenue or an Olympic sport, there's going to be opportunities if you have cultivated, or if you're cultivating your brand, or you've already cultivated a bit coming into college, to be able to take advantage of that financially, not at an immense level, but enough of a level that you would get something out.
Now, the next one comes from Craig, and he asked, what levels of disclosure exist between athletes, athletics programs, and the NCAA? How do people know where and how money from NIL deals are flowing? Good one.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, Craig. And that is an open question, I would say. A lot of these deals, and I've heard of several of these deals, are done in ways where the athlete knows about it, the IRS knows about it, and the company that's giving the deal knows about it, and that's about it. And to some degree, that's how the schools, the athletic departments and the NCAA have wanted it, because the other side of the you can't use the university's marks and logos part of the equation is, well, then it's not our business. It's not our deal. We're not involved in it. So whatever money you're making, you're good to go on. Now, the big question mark comes around these collectives, which I mentioned in the presentation. And that's the big gray area. And I don't think we necessarily know how that process is going to play out, whether there's going to be some kind of a reporting requirement, whether there even should be a reporting requirement. And a lot of this comes back to this idea of, does the NCAA have a role in this period? Because a lot of what you see in the arguments about the NCAA is this idea that there needs to be some kind of a level playing field, that there needs to be rules that apply to everybody and everybody abides by those rules. And then when we have a champion in Division I or whatever, that was accomplished in a way that meant everybody was on equal footing. Now, if you followed college sports, that never happens. Kansas was in the Final Four this year and has major, FBI level allegations against their athletic department for recruiting violations. It happened just a few years ago. Nobody asked a thing about it. Nobody said anything. It was like, oh, great, Kansas is back in the Final Four. And that's happened every year or close to every year in college basketball, in college football. So to some degree, I do think we need to go back and fundamentally question, can there even be a trade organization or a governing body like the NCAA involved in these sorts of things, where they're saying, well, we need to know how much is this person's making or how much is being spent. Because I don't know at this point that there's a way to get that horse back in the barn. To me, this would be very difficult to rein back in.
I was at that Final Four game, and I'd tell you that some of the Villanova fans had a few things to say about those allegations. They weren't very happy about that. The next one is from Victoria, who asked, where do the 501c3 NIL collectives fit in the new paradigm? IU now has one, so does Clemson, Texas A&M.
I think they're vital because under the current guidelines, a school who needs to have a support structure in place to bring in high-level athletes to be able to compete for athletes commercially, essentially at this point, they're not allowed to do so directly by the NCAA. And I think schools that have developed or had these collectives develop, whether they just developed on their own or whether the athletic department in talking with people was like, hey, this would be great if we had this. However the setup is, that has become the conduit for a lot of these deals. And I think that ultimately, if they're 501c3, if they're nonprofit, that's a huge advantage because that allows a lot more people to, to give money. I think it makes it a more attractive setup from a financial perspective. And look, I think what we're going to see as we move forward on this is eventually everybody has one of those, and therefore the advantage of having one is lessened because you're now dealing on relatively even footing with most of your competitors. But as of right now, I think the schools that have formed these early and have been able to start recruiting with them and around them, that's where the advantage is right now. We'll see how that transpires. I think it's going to be a really interesting space to watch.
The next one comes from Drew, who has questions about where the recruiting rules and parameters with coaches fit into this whole thing. So one of the concerns with boosters and NIL is that it's a way to skirt the rules. Their question is, can anything be done about this, or would the courts continue to side against the NCAA?
Hi, Drew. Thank you for joining. Drew's an old friend of mine.
Hi, Drew.
Here's the thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that a lot of what's gone on, first of all, it's fundamentally important that we all understand that when people say that a school broke the law, and then you ask what they mean and they say, oh, they broke NCAA recruiting rules. The NCAA recruiting rules are not the law. Those are essentially like an agreed upon like trade deal between athletic departments saying you will and will not do these particular things. And, there's a reason why, NCAA infractions committee doesn't have subpoena power, doesn't have the ability to bring someone in and compel testimony, because they're not the law. They act like the law because we do not have enough time to go into the full history of the NCAA, but that's essentially what made the NCAA a viable entity post World War II, was that they said, we're going to be the cops. You're going to set these rules and we're going to police the rules. And that's worked for the organization for quite a while. It's one of the two main things they do, along with organizing championships and managing the NCAA men's basketball tournament money. But my perspective on this point is the courts are going to continue to side against the NCAA because there's no way to effectively parse that out. And even as we saw in this FBI Adidas deal that occurred, even if you've got people on tape saying that they're doing X, Y, and Z, you could very easily say, well, that person wasn't actually speaking for the institution. And what are you going to do at that point? There's not really a good way to prove against it. So I think this is where it becomes increasingly harder in this day and age to say we have the right as an organization to restrict what schools are doing. And I think it's important to keep in mind that's the history of college sports pre-1948, where the whole reason the NCAA stepped into that role and why there was a sanity code to try to rein in payments of players and financial aid was because at the end of the day, college athletic programs are basically independent businesses that come together for commercial purposes. But at the end of the day, they're all competing with each other. Ohio State and Indiana and Michigan might all be in the same conference. Ohio State and Michigan turned Indiana into the NCAA in 1958 over recruiting violations. There's no love there. It's a business. So I think ultimately, to some degree, it's like every person for themselves in this process. And while I think Drew brings up a lot of good points as far as what the rules are right now, I think they become increasingly harder to enforce. Caveat, I'm not a lawyer, but I read a lot of lawyer stuff. So this is based on a lot of what I've read over the course of time.
The next one comes from Dave, who asked, NCAA now fears possible congressional action because legislators desire to allow athletes to organize as school employees. How does this impact creating any type of national standards?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, there's a bill in Iowa right now that actually classifies athletes as employees of the university. And it's a little bit of an ironic thing that's occurring now because, like, you'll notice in this whole presentation, I've never once used the phrase student athlete. Grace knows that I have an allergy to that particular phrase because it was born out of an effort of the NCAAs in the late 1950s to not have to pay workman's compensation to a football player at a college in, I think, Colorado, who died while playing football. His widow sued the school, and the claim was, well, he wasn't playing football. He was a student who just happened to be engaged in this athletic endeavor, hence the term student athlete. Now, we're seeing this in a lot of different phases of society, this idea that, well, we're going to give you our labor for free, or we're going to take a subordinate position from a labor perspective, that a lot of people have started to question that. And so it would be interesting, I think, from the standpoint of, do you qualify as an employee if you're a college athlete? There's a lot of arguments in favor of that, between mandated practice time, mandated travel time, mandated game time. That's oftentimes well over the 29-hour-a-week minimum for even being a part-time employee. But the big question ultimately, philosophically, is, do you qualify as an actual employee in that case? And then what are you entitled to from a compensation perspective? It's a little outside the bounds of this particular conversation, but it certainly fits in, and it'll have an impact on how this whole topic plays out over the next 10 years.
Deb asked, how might NIL impact D3 or Ivy League schools which have no athletic scholarships?
It's an interesting question, because those types of schools tend to be a little more at arm's length with their athletic programs from a competitive perspective. I mean, the Ivy League schools, were among the best schools in college football for the first 80 or so years that the sport existed, and they backed away from it right around the same time that the current model really got going. The 1930s, 40s, and into the 50s. But that was largely because those schools, or say the University of Chicago, didn't need the national marketing, the alumni connection generation that happens out of college athletics, because they already had it. But I do think that for college athletes that are at those institutions, you're talking about an opportunity to be able to profit off your name, image, and likeness. And a lot of athletes at those schools tend to be from, families with relatively wealthy backgrounds, families with, with interesting, commercial heritage and the ability to leverage things a little bit more on the national marketplace. So I think for some of those schools, it could have a positive impact in terms of who they're able to bring in. But I also think just in general, it's more of an individual brand building thing that could help athletes at those schools take more advantage of who they are and where they're at within the marketplace.
We have time for just one more, and we're going to answer Michael's question, which is some of the angsty feeling because the transfer portal and NIL arrived at roughly the same time, even though they're not necessarily related?
Mike, also an old friend of mine. Good to see you on here, Mike. Thanks for joining. So I think that's part of it. And I think that for a lot of people, the connection between NIL and transfer portal is going to always be there because they did kind of hit at the same time. But in reality, I think where the angstiness is coming from is a lot of people's perceptions of college athletics and college athletes is that college athletes are amateurs, they're not getting paid, they're doing it for the love of the sport, and that should be how it is. That's how we want our college sports. And you're seeing a lot of articles quoting a lot of coaches, a lot of football coaches saying, I don't think this is right. And college fans tend to identify with the coaches because the players come and go every 2, 3, 4 years, but the coaches are essentially the avatars for the programs that they lead. And so I think a lot of it is uncomfortability on the part of the coaches and the athletic departments with essentially a new world order of college sports. And fans tend to get their cues from that. I think that's going to be that way for a while. I think the younger generation looks at this and says, I don't get what the big deal is. Like, this is great. Athletes are getting paid for their worth. But for a lot of people, it's anathema to what they think of as far as college sports is concerned. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Thank you so much for answering all those questions, and that wraps up things. I'm going to bring back Vanessa now to join us.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you again for joining us and participating in this evening's live stream. I would like to thank Professor Clavio and Ms. Ybarra for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. Additionally, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the IU Alumni Association and its members for assisting with tonight's program. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support the faculty, students, and programs of the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the Arts and Sciences Priority Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. Until next time, please take care and stay safe. Thank you.